Racist cop slaps black woman, not knowing she holds evidence that rewrites every case he ever touched. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Angela Carter had always carried herself with quiet confidence. At 38, she wasn't someone who made waves. She moved through life with the grace of someone who had seen it all, but never let it show. Today, however, she was walking into a storm. The courtroom was bustling with the usual chaos, a mix of murmurs, papers shuffling, and the occasional clink of metal. People filled the seats, their eyes focused on the ongoing trial. Angela wasn't here for just any reason. She was here as a witness in a case she had been secretly investigating for months. Sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, she observed the scene before her. The judge's gavel echoed, the air thick with tension, but Angela was unfazed. She had learned long ago to remain calm, to never let her emotions surface. The accused, a police officer named Ryan Mitchell, was sitting in the defendant's chair. His smug expression did little to hide the arrogance that emanated from him. He had been a part of several controversial cases, ones that had resulted in tragic outcomes for people of color. His reputation was stained, and Angela knew it. As the trial progressed, the usual drama unfolded. But for Angela, this wasn't just another courtroom drama. She was here for one reason: to expose the truth. But Mitchell had no idea who she truly was. To him, she was just another black woman, one who didn't belong in a space like this. And he made sure to make her feel that way. The tension in the room grew as the lawyer for the defense made his case. Mitchell's eyes scanned the room, landing on Angela for just a moment, then dismissing her as if she were insignificant. He didn't realize that the woman he was belittling was about to change everything. The moment finally came. Angela stood up, her movements deliberate and calm. The crowd's murmurs died down as she made her way to the stand. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this moment for months, and it was time to reveal what she had uncovered. As she approached the stand, Mitchell's expression turned to one of confusion. He had no idea who she was or what she was about to reveal. With a steady voice, Angela began to speak. What if I told you that the cases you've been a part of, the cases you thought you were untouchable in, were built on lies? She said, her words piercing the silence. The room fell still. Angela's hands moved slightly as she pulled out a folder from her bag. Inside, there were records, evidence, and transcripts, everything Mitchell had tried to hide. You see, I've been investigating you for months, she continued, her gaze fixed firmly on Mitchell. And now, it's time for the world to see the truth. The shock on Mitchell's face was palpable as the evidence unfolded before him. The weight of his actions, the lives he had destroyed, all came crashing down in an instant. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. Angela's voice remained steady as she laid out the facts, revealing Mitchell's connections to a web of corruption that had been kept hidden for far too long. The truth had finally come to light, and there was no turning back. Mitchell's smug demeanor vanished, replaced by panic as he realized that the very woman he had tried to belittle was the one who had exposed his darkest secrets. Justice was no longer a far-off concept. It was here, in this room, in front of everyone. The tables had turned, and Mitchell was now the one who would be judged. Angela's mission was complete. She had not only taken down a corrupt officer, but had also set the stage for the downfall of an entire system. As the evidence was handed over to the authorities, the weight of what had just transpired settled over the room. Mitchell's career was over, and Angela's quiet justice had been delivered. With a final look at Mitchell, Angela turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a legacy of truth and integrity that would not be forgotten. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as the truth about Officer Ryan Mitchell came to light. Angela Carter had just made her revelation, and the weight of it hung in the air like a heavy cloud. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, as the evidence she had painstakingly gathered was passed around. Mitchell's face was pale, his previously smug demeanor completely shattered. But Angela was calm. She knew what she had to do, and this was just the beginning. With the courtroom still in stunned silence, Angela walked back to her seat, her heart steady, though her mind raced with everything that had led to this moment. She was more than just an FBI agent. She was the embodiment of years of hard work, a relentless pursuit of justice, and a determination to bring accountability to a broken system. She had been investigating Mitchell for months, watching him closely, gathering evidence, all while maintaining a low profile. She had made herself invisible, blending in perfectly as a regular citizen, all while ensuring that the corrupt officer's every move was documented. Angela had known from the start that it would take more than a typical investigation to take down someone like Mitchell. She would need to outsmart him, to be 2 steps ahead, and to use the power of truth as her weapon. And now, with that weapon in her hands, it was time for the system to finally face the consequences of its own corruption. The judge, who had been sitting silently through the entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice filled with authority. "Officer Mitchell, you are hereby removed from your position. Your actions have been proven to be in direct violation of the law, and you will face the full extent of the consequences for your actions," the judge declared. Mitchell didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the floor, as if ashamed of what he had become. His career, built on lies and deceit, was crumbling in front of him. Angela remained calm, her gaze unwavering as the judge turned to address the rest of the courtroom. "This is not just a victory for Angela Carter," the judge continued. "This is a victory for all those who have been wronged, for all those whose voices have been silenced. This is a reminder that no one, no matter their position, is above the law." Angela couldn't help but feel a small surge of pride. This was what she had been fighting for. This was the justice she had dreamed of bringing. But it wasn't over yet. She still had more work to do. As the proceedings came to a close, Angela gathered her things and walked out of the courtroom. The weight of the case was still heavy on her shoulders, but the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served kept her moving forward. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city streets. The cool breeze brushed against her face as she walked toward her car. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, reflecting on everything that had happened. She knew that her work wasn't finished. There were still so many more cases, so many more officers like Mitchell who needed to be held accountable. But for now, Angela allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that today, justice had been served. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and drove off into the night, her resolve stronger than ever. The fight was far from over, but Angela was ready for whatever came next. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Angela. The weight of her success in the courtroom was still settling in, but she couldn't afford to get complacent. She knew that while Mitchell's downfall was a victory, it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. As she sat at her desk, reviewing case files and evidence, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her partner at the FBI, Mark, who had been working with her on this case from the start. "We need to talk. Urgent." Angela's fingers paused over her keyboard. She stared at the screen for a moment before responding, "I'll be there in an hour." The urgency in his message was enough to make her drop everything. Mark was someone she trusted implicitly, and if he was reaching out, it meant something big was happening. Angela grabbed her jacket, took one last look at the case files, and left her office. The drive to Mark's office felt longer than it should have. The city around her buzzed with life, but her mind was elsewhere. As she pulled into the parking garage, she could feel the familiar tension in her chest. Tighten. She knew that the Mitchell case, while significant, was only the beginning. She entered the building and made her way to the elevator. Mark's office was on the top floor, the perfect vantage point to see everything happening in the city below. When she stepped inside, Mark was pacing back and forth, his face etched with concern. "Angela, I've been looking into Mitchell's past cases," he began, his voice low. "There's something you need to see." He handed her a file that looked thick, heavier than any of the others she had dealt with. Angela opened it carefully, scanning the documents inside. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the names and the details. Cases that had been buried, evidence that had been manipulated, witnesses whose voices had been silenced. These aren't just random cases, Mark continued. They're connected. Mitchell was part of a network. There are other officers involved, some high up in the ranks. Angela felt her heart skip a beat. The realization hit her hard. Mitchell was only a small piece of the puzzle. She had taken down one corrupt officer, but there were many more hidden in plain sight, operating within the system. What do we do now? Angela asked, her voice steady but filled with urgency. We keep digging, Mark replied. But we have to be careful. These people are powerful. They won't go down easily. Angela nodded, her mind racing with the new information. She knew what needed to be done, and she wasn't backing down now. The fight for justice was far from over. She stood up, determination in her eyes. Let's bring them all down. The next few weeks were filled with long nights and tireless investigation. Angela and Mark worked together, tracking leads, interviewing witnesses, and collecting the missing pieces of the puzzle. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they uncovered. Angela was relentless. Every document, every piece of evidence felt like a step closer to exposing the entire network. But with every breakthrough, there was also a growing sense of danger. Angela knew that the more she uncovered, the more she was putting herself at risk. But she couldn't stop now. Too many lives were at stake. Too many people had suffered in silence for too long. One evening, as Angela sat at her desk, reviewing surveillance footage from a recent case, her phone buzzed again. It was an anonymous message. You're getting too close. The message sent a chill down her spine. She stared at the words, her mind racing. She had known the risks all along, but this was a direct warning. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Angela set the phone down, her resolve harder than ever. She would finish this. She would expose the truth, no matter the cost. As she leaned back in her chair, the weight of her mission settled in. She had no idea what the next move would be, but she was ready. The battle was just beginning, and Angela Carter was more determined than ever to bring the entire system of corruption to its knees. The following days were a blur for Angela. She had barely finished the last phase of the Mitchell case when she found herself thrust deeper into a web of corruption far more complex than she had ever imagined. The anonymous warning had shaken her, but it only fueled her determination to push forward. She was used to fighting battles in the shadows, but this felt different. As she sat at her desk late one night, sifting through more files, the door to her office opened. Mark entered, looking even more exhausted than usual. His face was grim. I think we found something, he said, his voice low, almost urgent. Angela stood up immediately, her pulse quickening. What is it? Mark set a folder down in front of her. She opened it slowly, scanning the documents inside. It didn't take long for her to see the connection. The corruption within the police force went far beyond Mitchell. The network was not just local. It stretched across state lines, involving high-ranking officials from various law enforcement agencies. Angela's heart sank. She had suspected there was more to the story, but the extent of the operation stunned her. How deep does this go? She asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. Deep enough that if we go public, it could destroy more than just a few careers, Mark replied. We're talking about a full-blown conspiracy, Angela. This involves people at the highest levels. Angela's mind raced. She knew this was bigger than anything she had dealt with before. Every piece of evidence she had uncovered so far was just a small part of a massive puzzle. She stared at the files in front of her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. We have to take them down, Angela said quietly, but with a fierce resolve. But we can't do it alone. This is going to take more than just us. Mark nodded, agreeing. I'll reach out to the higher-ups. We need their backing if we're going to make this work. Angela's thoughts were already moving faster than her words could keep up. She had been working tirelessly to gather information, but this was a different kind of fight, one that could bring down not just corrupt officers, but an entire system. As she gathered her things, preparing to head out to meet with Mark's contacts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes had just been raised. Every decision, every move she made from this point on would be under scrutiny. There would be no room for mistakes. As Angela and Mark drove to their next destination, a sense of unease settled over her. They were on the brink of something huge, but there were no guarantees. The people they were about to take on weren't just officers. They were well-connected, dangerous, and willing to go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. Angela glanced at Mark, her mind still racing with the implications of everything they had uncovered. "Are we ready for this?" she asked. Mark met her gaze, his expression serious. "We don't have a choice. The truth has to come out." They arrived at a secluded building just outside the city limits. Angela took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. She could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her shoulders. But there was no turning back now. She was in this until the end. The door to the building opened, and a familiar face greeted them, one of their most trusted allies in the investigation. As they entered, Angela felt the tension in the air. They were getting closer, but the danger was palpable. The conspiracy they were about to expose would not only shake the foundations of law enforcement, it would change everything. Angela knew that the road ahead would be long and perilous, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. Justice wasn't just about taking down bad officers. It was about making sure the system worked for everyone, and she wasn't going to stop until it did. Angela stood in the cold, dimly lit hallway of the abandoned building, her heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment they had been building toward for weeks. She and Mark had followed the trail of corruption to this very place, a hideout used by some of the most powerful people involved in the network they had been tracking. As the door creaked open, Angela's eyes adjusted to the darkness inside. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. She exchanged a quick glance with Mark, who nodded, signaling her to follow him. They weren't alone here. There were others, allies who had been gathering intelligence for them. The plan was simple: get the evidence they needed, confront the players involved, and expose everything. But Angela knew the risks. They were stepping into a lion's den, and any wrong move could cost them everything. She could feel the tension building in her chest as they moved deeper into the building. Every sound seemed amplified, every footstep echoing in the silence. Mark led the way, his hand steady on the flashlight as it flickered across the walls. The place felt abandoned, but Angela knew better. The people they were after had been using it as a safe house, a place where they could continue their operations without fear of being caught. They had to be careful. As they reached the room at the end of the hall, Angela felt her heart race. She didn't know what she expected, but she knew this was the moment where everything would change. The door opened slowly, revealing a small, cluttered room. There were piles of documents, old computers, and file cabinets stacked against the walls. The dim light revealed faces Angela had only seen in photos, the people who had been pulling the strings of the network. She was face to face with some of the most corrupt officers in the system. Her pulse quickened, but she remained calm. Mark moved quickly, heading toward one of the file cabinets. Angela joined him, scanning the room for any signs of danger. They had to act fast. The files were important. If they could get them, they would have the final proof needed to bring the entire operation down. As Angela rifled through the files, she could hear faint voices from down the hallway. Her instincts kicked in. "We need to move now," she whispered to Mark. He nodded, grabbing as many files as he could carry. Angela quickly stuffed several documents into her bag. They didn't have much time. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Angela knew they had been discovered. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice low but firm. Mark glanced at her, his eyes wide. "Angela, we have to go. Now." But Angela wasn't ready to leave yet. She needed more. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down. "We need the hard drives," she said, her voice urgent. "It's all on the computers." Mark hesitated, but then, without another word, he moved toward the computer station. Angela turned to the others in the room. "Get the files out now. We can't afford to leave anything behind." As Mark worked, Angela stood watch, her eyes darting back and forth. The pressure was building. She could hear the sound of doors opening down the hallway. They had to finish this quickly. Mark grabbed the hard drives and shoved them into his bag. Angela was already moving toward the door. Just as she turned the handle, she heard voices. Someone was coming. Without a second thought, she threw the door open and darted into the hallway, motioning for Mark to follow. They ran. Every step felt like it could be their last. The building's halls seemed endless, but Angela's focus never wavered. They had the evidence they needed, and they weren't about to let anyone take it from them. They reached the exit and burst into the night air. Angela took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze fill her lungs. They had made it out, but this was far from over. They had just uncovered the tip of the iceberg. Angela looked at Mark, her determination unwavering. "We've got what we need. Now, let's bring them down." The night was just beginning, and Angela knew the fight wasn't over. But as long as she was standing, she wouldn't stop until justice was served. Angela sat in her car, the weight of the hard drives and files pressing heavily beside her. The night was calm, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise still world around her. She hadn't said much on the drive back, her mind consumed with the events of the past few hours. They had gotten the evidence they needed, but they weren't out of the woods yet. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Mark. "They know. We need to move fast." Angela's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She had expected this. No operation of this magnitude would go unnoticed for long. The people involved in this conspiracy were powerful, and now that they knew she and Mark had what they needed, they would stop at nothing to cover their tracks. She looked down the empty street, her mind already racing with plans. They couldn't afford to wait. Angela quickly responded to Mark, "Meet me at the usual place. We need to go over everything." She drove through the quiet streets, the city around her still asleep, unaware of the storm that was brewing beneath its surface. The familiar location wasn't far, a small cafe tucked away in a corner of the city. It had been their meeting place for years, a neutral ground where they could talk without the risk of being overheard. As Angela pulled into the parking lot, she saw Mark's car already there. He was waiting for her. She parked beside him, grabbed the bag with the files, and made her way into the cafe. The door chimed as she entered, and Mark stood up from the corner booth where he had been waiting. They exchanged a brief nod before Angela slid into the seat opposite him. "They've got to be panicking by now," Mark said, his voice low. "We've exposed everything they've worked so hard to cover up. But now we're the target." Angela looked down at the files on the table. The hard drives contained everything they needed: documents, communications, and evidence of an elaborate conspiracy. But getting the information was only half the battle. They now had to expose it to the world before those responsible could destroy it. "We've got one shot at this," Angela said, her voice calm but determined. "We go public with the evidence, and we make sure it can't be ignored." Mark leaned forward, his face serious. "What about the risk? If we do this, we're putting ourselves in the line of fire. These people are dangerous." Angela nodded, understanding the stakes. "I know, but it's time to end this. We've come too far to turn back now." They spent the next few hours reviewing everything, double-checking the files, and making sure they had everything in place for the reveal. The plan was simple. They would leak the information to the media, forcing the authorities to act. They couldn't let the corrupt officers get away with it. The clock was ticking, and Angela felt the pressure building. As they finalized their strategy, Angela couldn't help but think back to everything that had led her to this point. The long nights, the risk of being discovered, the countless hours spent tracking down leads and uncovering secrets. It had all come down to this moment. They had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to let it slip away. When the plan was set, Angela stood up, her decision made. "Let's do this." Mark nodded in agreement, and together they left the cafe. Angela felt a surge of determination. The journey was far from over, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop until the system that had allowed so much corruption to thrive was brought to its knees. Angela and Mark sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of their plan pressing down on them. The final step was now upon them. They had spent weeks gathering evidence, and now it was time to take everything public. Angela felt the nervous energy in her chest, but she didn't allow it to show. She had trained herself to be calm in high-pressure situations, and tonight was no different. They had to make sure every detail was perfect. The evidence was already in the hands of the media. Angela had contacted a trusted reporter earlier that day, someone who had the power to make the story known to the public and ensure it couldn't be silenced. The moment the article went live, the entire system they had been fighting against would be exposed. She glanced over at Mark, who was staring at his phone. He looked just as focused, his eyes scanning the latest messages from their contact. "It's done," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of what was to come. "The article's live." Angela stood up, taking a deep breath. Her fingers clenched into fists, not out of fear, but out of resolve. "Now we wait," she said quietly. The minutes seemed to stretch out in front of her as she stared at the screen, knowing that in a matter of moments, everything would change. They had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The first notification came through. Then another, and another. Soon, the flood of messages and calls started pouring in. News outlets across the country were picking up the story, one that would shake the foundation of law enforcement. Angela felt a rush of adrenaline course through her veins, but it was quickly followed by the realization of just how much was at stake. She had always known that exposing corruption came with a price, but now the weight of that truth was heavier than ever. As the night wore on, the media coverage continued to grow. The story was everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before the authorities would have no choice but to respond. Angela knew that the people they had exposed would stop at nothing to protect themselves. She wasn't naive enough to think this was over. In fact, it was just the beginning. The system was vast, and the corruption went deep. The people in power would fight back with everything they had, but Angela wasn't afraid. This was the moment she had been working toward, and she was ready. Mark looked at her, his face unreadable, but his eyes reflecting the same determination she felt. "What now?" he asked. Angela's gaze was unwavering. "Now we make sure the truth stays out there," she said, her voice firm. "We can't let them sweep it under the rug. We'll keep pushing until the system changes. This isn't just about taking down one corrupt officer or one network. It's about making sure this never happens again." As they sat there, the quiet hum of the outside world seemed to fade away. Angela knew this would be a long and dangerous road, but she was prepared to walk it. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. The battle for justice was just beginning, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Angela woke up to a phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. She rubbed her eyes and reached for it, groggily checking the notifications. The story had gone viral. News outlets everywhere were covering the massive corruption scandal, the connections, the cover-ups, and an entire network that had been exposed. But with the rising media frenzy came the inevitable backlash. As Angela scanned the messages, she saw threats, anonymous, tips warning her to back off, and veiled promises of retaliation. She wasn't surprised. She had known the risks all along. The system they had just shaken was vast, and the people at the top would do anything to protect themselves. Still, Angela wasn't backing down. She knew what needed to be done. The fight was just beginning. Mark was already at her door before she could finish her coffee. "We need to move fast," he said, his face tight with concern. "The higher-ups are starting to react. They're circling, and I don't trust some of the people on our side anymore. We can't let them bury this." Angela nodded, taking a deep breath. She had anticipated this moment, the moment when the truth would be exposed and the people in power would fight back. But she was prepared. They weren't just exposing corruption. They were dismantling a system. "We need to stay ahead of them," Angela replied. "We can't afford any slip-ups. Let's make sure the evidence is safe and that we're ready for whatever comes next." Mark agreed. The urgency in his voice matched her own. They couldn't afford to trust anyone who wasn't fully committed to the cause. They had to keep pushing forward no matter how dangerous it got. As the day unfolded, Angela and Mark worked tirelessly to make sure the story didn't lose momentum. They arranged meetings with trusted allies, ensuring that the truth would continue to spread, no matter how hard the opposition tried to silence it. The higher-ups in law enforcement were scrambling. Some tried to play damage control, but Angela knew the tide had already turned. People were listening. Change was on the horizon. Angela had spent years working in the shadows, gathering information, building cases, and watching as corrupt officers twisted the law for their own benefit. But now, the story was too big to ignore. She had broken through the walls of secrecy, and the truth was pouring out, like a flood that could no longer be contained. As the days passed, the story continued to dominate headlines. The pressure on the corrupt officers mounted. They tried to deflect, to discredit Angela, to say she was just a rogue agent acting alone, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Witnesses came forward, confirming the stories, backing up the details Angela had uncovered. The system, for the first time in years, was beginning to fracture. Angela knew they weren't safe yet. There were still those who would try to shut them down, who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But for the first time, Angela felt a spark of hope. The truth was out there. It wasn't going anywhere. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction as she watched the events unfold. The fight was far from over, but Angela was no longer alone in it. The world was watching now. Justice was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The ripple effect of their actions had only just begun, and Angela was ready to see it through to the end. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. The story of corruption, deceit, and abuse of power was now a national sensation. The pressure was on. Angela and Mark knew they had to stay one step ahead, but the relentless media coverage was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it ensured the truth was out there for the world to see. On the other, it made them targets. As Angela sat in her apartment late one evening, reviewing new information that had come in, her phone buzzed again. It was a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. "Angela Carter?" The voice on the other end was deep, steady, and far too familiar. "This is Chief Anderson. I need to talk to you. It's urgent." Her heart skipped a beat. Chief Anderson was one of the highest-ranking officers in the department, and until now, he had kept his distance. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. "I know what you've uncovered. I know what you're trying to do. But you need to stop. You have no idea who you're up against," the chief replied. Angela's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. "I'm not stopping. Not now, not ever. The truth is out there, and it's not going away." There was a long pause on the line before Anderson spoke again, his voice lower now, tinged with something like respect, or maybe fear. "You're playing a dangerous game, Angela. These people will stop at nothing to protect themselves." "I'm not afraid of them," she replied, her resolve unshakable. "I'm going to keep going, and when it's all over, they'll pay for what they've done." The line went quiet for a moment, and Angela felt the weight of the conversation settle in. She wasn't just up against a few corrupt officers anymore. She was going after an entire system that had been built to protect the guilty and punish the innocent. Chief Anderson's voice finally broke the silence. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "There are others who want to see this through, but you need to be careful. They'll try to silence you. I won't be able to protect you forever." Angela felt a surge of gratitude, but she didn't let it show. "I'll be careful, but I'm not stopping." As the call ended, Angela sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She was more determined than ever. The truth was her weapon, and she would use it until the very end. The phone rang again, this time from Mark. "Angela, it's happening. The DA's office is about to announce an official investigation. This is it. We're going to take them down." A smile tugged at the corner of Angela's lips. The wheels of justice were finally in motion. "Let's make sure it sticks," she said, her voice fierce. Over the next few days, Angela and Mark worked tirelessly, coordinating with their allies, making sure the information was in the right hands, and preparing for the inevitable retaliation. They knew the stakes were high. Every decision they made, every move they took could be their last. But Angela was ready. The system had failed so many for so long. Now, it was their turn to show the world that justice could prevail. The day of the announcement came, and Angela stood before a crowd of reporters, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. As the DA stepped up to the podium and the news cameras clicked on, Angela couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The system was finally being held accountable. The truth was no longer a secret. It was out in the open, and nothing would be the same again. As the press conference continued, Angela caught Mark's eye across the room. They shared a brief, knowing look. It wasn't over yet, but it was the beginning of the end for those who thought they could escape justice. The fight had been long, but Angela was determined to see it through to the very end.